Hello, Margaret Sullivan. You are a columnist for The Guardian US and the executive director of the Craig Newmark Center for Journalism, Ethics and Security at Columbia Journalism School. You were the longest-serving public editor at the New York Times and the first woman in that role. You also were the Washington Post media columnist and the chief editor of your hometown daily, the Buffalo News. You are the author of 2 books, Ghosting the News and Newsroom Confidential. Looking forward to your discussion.
Thank you.
Hi, it's my pleasure to introduce the upcoming guest speaker, Julie Gerstein. You are currently working as a research fellow at the Craig Newmark Center for Journalism, Ethics and Security at Columbia University. You're former executive editor for Business Insider, where you were also the founding bureau chief of the Singapore office. And additionally, you were an editor at BuzzFeed. And alongside Margaret Sullivan, you contributed to New Look on Journalism Ethics report, dealing with the new ethical challenges for journalists.
Thank you very much. It's so nice to be here. It's great to be in Paris, and it's really a great privilege to speak to young journalists. So Julie and I did a big sweeping look at whether it was appropriate to have a fresh view of journalism ethics because of this moment we're in, the digital age, the moment of AI, a time when politicians seem to be lying more than ever before. And we looked at a bunch of different topics, but because our time is limited today, if you want to see the whole thing, you can read it in Columbia Journalism Review. If you look at sort of our names and journalism ethics, you'll find the whole 6-part series. But today, because our time is limited, we want to narrow it down to just 2 topics, whether we need a fresh look at objectivity and the ethical challenges around AI. So, Julie, you want to say a few things before we start?
Thanks so much for having us. I want to say that we worked on this project over 2024 into 2025, and obviously a lot was going on
in the world.
And we really wanted to speak to kind of the challenges of our particular crises in the US, but I think that a lot of these issues are more global, despite a lot of our research around how newsrooms have been disappearing and local news sources are going away. We know that's happening in the US, and we know that there's fewer sources abroad as well.
So just to jump into one of our 2 major topics, the question of whether we need a new look at objectivity. So, if you ask sort of regular people like the audience or readers, do you think objectivity is a good idea? They will definitely say yes, they do. But in practice, it seems like what we often have is a kind of objectivity that doesn't really work that well anymore, because where's it coming from? And sort of the question that arises is, whose objectivity is it? And so this business of objectivity as the view from nowhere is something to consider. We all have issues, we all have beliefs, and we all have sort of experiences, and what is it we bring to the table? And then at that point, I think we can challenge our own confirmation biases. We can say, well, I've always thought this, but I'm going to report against that, and look at things a little bit differently. The other thing that comes up with traditional objectivity as a problem is what has kind of been termed both sidesism. And both sidesism is a practice in which, lies and truth are treated kind of equally, and that's not journalism. We really shouldn't be saying, well, some people say that it's raining outside and some people say the sky is blue. We should go outside and find out what's going on. So, our effort is to push back in a thoughtful way against traditional objectivity by saying, yes, we want to bring an open mind to every story, but so much comes down to how a story is framed. What do we choose to look at? What do we choose to investigate? You know, what headline is on it? What photo is with it? All these things come from someplace, and so it's kind of not appropriate to call it, to subscribe to this view from nowhere. And I always like to present the opposite argument here, which a former boss of mine, Marty Barron at the Washington Post, and if you've ever seen the movie Spotlight, great movie, Marty was, at that time, you know, he was depicted by Liev Schreiber, but he was the editor of the Boston Globe. And Marty's point of view on objectivity is, yes, we do need traditional objectivity, because what it really means is the method that we come into a story with, that we come in with an open mind and we attempt to challenge and prove it along the way. So, you know, there are different ways to look at this. I think our point of view is that the old style objectivity that informed newsrooms and informed decision-making for a long time is outdated, and yet we still want to, we hope that journalists do come into every story with an open mind.
Earlier, there was a mention about social media as an issue for a lot of journalists, and especially, I think there's this tension between what people feel as individuals and what they are responsible for as journalists. That really, for many journalists, came to a head in 2020 during the racial reckoning, and after followed by the murder of George Floyd. And what came out of that was really a lot of people said, you know, this white Western ideal of objectivity, it doesn't allow me as a journalist to express myself. And that became more of an issue because newsrooms have become more diverse. The other thing that we're seeing is that there is a generational divide on objectivity. So there's a lot of younger journalists who feel that the construct of objectivity has to go, and they're more comfortable thinking about journalism in terms of advocacy. But, you know, there's also others who argue that, you know, moving towards a pragmatic objectivity or solutions journalism is perhaps the way forward.
I feel like each one of these topics is so rich, and we could probably spend the whole day talking about any one of them, objectivity or AI or the topics that have already come up. But I think we'll move to the question of AI in the newsroom, because it's very fraught. It's very much in the moment. And as Jessica said in her talk, it's like sort of the new bubble. The one thing that I've found is that as newsroom leaders come up with their, you know, guidebooks, their style books, they're almost immediately outdated by the way AI is moving so quickly through newsrooms. It's incredible. I mean, I've actually had a standards editor say to me, oh yeah, we wrote these rules, and then I look at our website and the rules are being broken in real time, you know, in our very publication. So it's really a fast-moving thing, and it's both tremendously, there's a lot of opportunity and there's a lot of room for it to go wrong. So, but Julie's very good on this subject, so I'll hand it off to her.
Yeah, I think, you know, probably all of us are aware that AI as a concept has been around for a while. I think that the thing that we're dealing with in newsrooms now is this construct of generative AI, you know, and kind of how is that being used, and is it potentially putting journalists out of work? Is it potentially a problem for newsrooms in terms of accountability? And then also, you know, there's also the opportunities of AI. So AI models are fed by our writing, by the work that journalists and newsrooms do. And for some publications, a lot of publications, part of their funding model is now, licensing their content to these AI models. So it creates an interesting dependence between these two things that are, I think, fundamentally at odds. We all know that...
It's kind of behind you.
There we go. We all know that there are some problems with AI. I've used this image a lot as an example of AI generating, ChatGPT generating images of a 1943 German soldier. So it has bias, implicit bias, but then it also sometimes will overcorrect and hallucinate. Generative AI, the results are only as good as the data on which it's trained. And so, as we become a more divided, striated society, we're going to see more extreme viewpoints and more misinformation coming from both sides, and that's going to feed these AI engines, unfortunately. So that said, I think a lot of newsrooms are still really enamored by AI, and I think generally businesses are. We're in a little bit of a bubble where everybody's just kind of saying, use AI, whether it makes sense or not, use AI, figure it out, figure out a way to do this. And it's sort of created a little bit of, or a lot of chaos in the newsroom. And as Margaret mentioned, a lot of what standards editors have been doing is trying to kind of establish, how do we address AI? How do we handle something like this? And how do we make it clear to our readers and our journalists what we expect of them? The main thrust of what a lot of newsrooms have come up with is like these three sort of main principles, which have to do with transparency and attribution of AI. And then also accountability. So if something is published that has incorrect information from AI, who is held responsible? And then thirdly, and I think most importantly, the idea of human in the loop to review. So these policies are kind of, coming out, and these AI tools are competing with each other. They're competing with newsrooms. They're competing with social media platforms, and they're competing with, and they're in an environment where more and more people are not getting their information from traditional news sources. And, according to a recent Pew poll, around 10% of Americans say they now get their news from sources like ChatGPT and Gemini, which,
It's probably more now.
Yeah, this is terrifying.
Last week, I think.
Yeah. And even though they also, they'll say that, but they'll also simultaneously say, we don't trust information anymore. And it's like, well, you guys are doing it to yourselves. But that said, I think that, in all of the work that we've looked at, core ideas of what it is to be a journalist and what the power, the importance of journalism, as Pablo said, to hold power to account, it still holds true, and it's still very important, even as we're sort of figuring out these things and figuring out how do we remain sustainable as an industry, how do we fight ideas about, our lack of credibility with our audiences. And part of what our sources in our research talked a lot about was this idea of how do we engage with the public to make sure that they're understanding what our ethics are, and allowing us to have a conversation around what are journalism ethics in the public space, because a lot of people have very poor media literacy, and our audiences don't understand how journalism is done. And really, transparency about things like that is how we build trust with our audiences.
So I think, our big takeaway, and I'll just conclude with this, and we can go to some questions if we have the time. is just that, I think, as Julie said, the core beliefs of journalism, that we're there to hold power to account, that we have to be honest about it, that we have to correct our mistakes. Those things haven't changed, but the sort of atmosphere in which we're working is very, very different. And so that's really what our series was trying to do, was to look at this sort of new environment and adjust our, hold fast to the things that make journalism great, but try to bring that into a new world and new environment. So thank you very much.
Let's raise your hands if you have any question.
Hi, thank you. Oh, sorry, a bit loud. Thank you so much for your talk. I had a question about objectivity and social media, and how, because we all recognize that social media is so important today and kind of in terms of opening up the conversation and sharing information. But at the same time, algorithms on social media reward a very specific kind of content, content that's not very objective, that's more opinionated, that's quite controversial. And with this in mind, how can we reconcile using social media to kind of promote and gain attention, but for objective journalism? Like, how do we use it to make objective methods kind of popular in an age where it rewards a very controversial type of content? Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess I would say that for journalists, to keep in mind that nobody out there is waiting for you to post, and that, you could take a minute and think about what you want to say. I agree with you that, presenting things in a very flat way that might be sort of apparently objective isn't going to get you the engagement that you might be looking for, but I still think that it has to be grounded in your reporting and not in, some sort of outlandish opinion about it, because it's going to get you in trouble. And, we've seen that happen over and over again. So it's always a good idea to, walk away from your phone for a moment, and take a beat and say, am I actually, as Pavla said, would you actually be comfortable with this being associated with you for all time, or be willing to shout it in the streets? If not, maybe there's a slightly tempered way to say it.
I would also add that your social media can be a way for you to talk about your process, and that can be a very powerful thing. Again, if we're talking about news journalism losing a sense of legitimacy, at least definitely in the US, in a major way it has, then showing how you built it, I think, is a very, very useful tool. I showed Margaret this recently. There's some Fox affiliate, believe it or not, in Texas, I want to say. They've started putting at the bottom of their stories the sources that they reference in the stories. So if they got information from Defense Department, they did interviews, whatever it is, they'll put that down there. And it's a little thing, but I think it, again, increases credibility and helps people feel like there was work put into this.
One last question, Victoria.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much for your talk. I had a question about AI and the deals that they might sign with medias. In France, it happened recently with like 2 big medias. I think it has to do with revenue streams and the data being taken by the AI anyways. It's crazy to think that we have people controlling the news, like a lot of power, little power controlling a lot of the news, and then on top, GAFAM controlling that. What's your take, would be your take on how is that going to evolve? What do you think should be done?
It's going to go not well.
I mean, we've got this sort of tension that's always been in journalism between the business side and the revenue side and the journalism side. But it's, I think, really intense now with what you're talking about. And there's, so much trouble with business models of journalism that this is seen as, a great way to shore ourselves up, and yet it decreases trust, it's full of problems and horrible disasters that happen, and, it really needs to be handled very judiciously, but there's a lot pushing against that. So there's a tension there that's really problematic.
Thank you very much. Thank you.